Hi, and welcome to Frontline Conversations. My name is Abhinav Chakraborty, and today I have Akshat Rathi with me in the studio. Akshat is an award winning senior reporter for Bloomberg News. He's the host of Zero, which is a climate podcast for Bloomberg Green. Akshat now has a book out, and it's called Climate Capitalism Winning the Global Race to Zero Emissions. It has been published by John Murray Press, which is an imprint of Hachette. Spread across five continents, climate capitalism tracks the unlikely heroes driving the fight against climate change. Through stories that bring people, policy, and technology together, Akshat Rathi reveals how the green economy is not just possible but profitable. I welcome you again to Frontline Conversations, Akshat.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
You say that you wrote climate capitalism as the antidote to, and I quote, the dominant doom laden narrative when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. Tell us about the process of writing the book.
So it began because of Donald Trump. He was at the time in 2016 running for president of the US. And among the many wild claims he had made, one of them was about how there is clean coal. And the way he described it, it was coal that was mined, then it was clean, then it was burned, and it was fine. But of course, he's not a man that goes over details, and he got the narrative wrong. And my editor at the time was very interested, and he said, what is he talking about? Is it just fiction? And the answer was actually, it was part fiction because the way he thought about it was wrong, but there was an actual technology that could capture emissions after coal were burned and trap them and not let it go into the atmosphere. And so it got me started into looking at solutions. What I found out was carbon capture, this technology, had existed for 50 years and was being deployed at scale, but not for climate purposes. And so my quest was to see whether there are solutions around the world, not just in America, not just in rich countries, but in countries like India, in China, that are being deployed at scale today. And that's what the book became about how it is actually happening all across the world, even as we hear dire climate reports and we hear dire climate predictions, which are true that we are going to head towards more extreme weather events. But it is also true that we are deploying climate solutions at a pace never seen before. So it's a two-track world that we live in, and I wanted to try and help people make sense of what seems like conflicting ideas.
You mentioned carbon capture, and I'll come to it in a bit. But first, you mentioned China, and you've written about China's electric vehicle revolution, and you've dedicated two chapters to it. So, in September 2023, India has said that it aims to be a global giant in the EV sector by 2030. So, what is your assessment of this claim, given that China's already making like more than half of the EVs in the world?
Let's understand how China did it to see whether India can. The Chinese approach to EVs was not driven by climate change. It was driven by an interest in ensuring that its people are able to have the kind of quality of life that was being enjoyed in Europe or America, and that in the process it's able to create a technology or an industry that is going to be something it can export or it can become a world leader in. And all that came from this character that I have in the book named Wang Gang. He grew up in China, he'd seen poverty, but he wanted to do something about it. And so he went and he studied in Germany, became an auto engineer, and he used to work for Audi when he realized, well, if China wants to live like the Germans do, we need to come up with not a car that runs on oil because there is just not enough oil in the world. We need to find alternative fuel sources. And so he convinced, this is in early 2000, he convinced the government, the Chinese government, the leadership at the time, to try and back him, to try and find a different way of powering a car. Now we know hydrogen existed, we know batteries existed, but they'd never been deployed at scale. There was a company that had done it in the past, here or there, some 100 cars here or there, but nothing at the millions that you would need for a solution. The Chinese government backed him. He said, I will need 5, 7 years. And he was given a secret program with very good funding to work with research institutes, come up with the answer. And by the time China had the Beijing Olympics in 2008, he had something to show for it. He worked with companies and research institutes to come up with electric buses and electric cars to showcase. And that got him the government's long term backing for what was going to come through in scaling up solutions on electric cars, which is between 2009, so after the Beijing Olympics, to 2017, the government spent $60 billion in trying to create not just the industry for making electric cars, but also the batteries that would power electric cars. And batteries kind of won out over hydrogen, and we can get into why. But that level of support for 2 decades is what enabled China to now, as you say, be the world's largest maker of electric cars, largest seller of electric cars in China, but also abroad. When it comes to India, the challenge is that India will need that level of systemic long term support to be able to come up with the answer. Now, it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, it doesn't need to figure out whether hydrogen is something it needs to back or what type of chemistry of lithium ion batteries it needs to back. That work has already been done for you by China, but it still does require its own capacity to be able to make both batteries and those cars in India. Now, India does make some of them. We have Tata and we have Mahindra who are making EVs. We have interest from other makers. We have foreign car companies coming in wanting to make EVs in India. So again, it's not something that again India needs to reinvent from the scratch. India has certain capacities, but it does require government support to push that over to become commercial, to become viable. And that requires policy support, that requires maybe incentives, maybe subsidies for people to buy these cars because they are still much more expensive than fossil fuel cars. And that's also something China did. It didn't just throw money at the problem, it created an incentive system on how to buy it. So in many cities, large cities like Shanghai or Beijing, you could not buy a fossil fuel car without paying a huge amount of money on top, sometimes as much as the cost of the car itself. So you're doubling the price of it. But if you wanted to buy an EV, you could just go out and buy it. So there was both carrots in form of subsidies, but also sticks in the form of not making people buy cheap fossil fuel cars. And India will have to use some of those policy tools to actually get this industry going.
You mentioned how batteries are getting way cheaper. I'm talking about lithium-ion batteries, which is great for fighting climate change. But mining the stuff for them, I'm referring to cobalt, in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, can be bad for people and the planet. So, should we just focus on making batteries even cheaper, or should we also figure out on how bad the hidden costs, say human or environmental costs, really are?
100%. I think one of the things that we've not done in the past is we've ignored or sometimes on purpose not looked at the environmental impacts of all the things that we consume. And now that we are much more aware of them, we should think about environmental impacts of everything that we deploy, whether it's a clean energy solution or not. Now, let's look at the facts. Yes, when you build a electric car versus a fossil fuel car, the amount of embedded emissions, so how much CO2 would have been released in the process of making that car. An electric car is actually much more polluting at the start than a fossil fuel car. But over the lifetime of that vehicle, even if the electric car is powered by a coal powered grid, it consumes way less emissions because it's just a much more efficient way of moving. For every unit of energy that an electric car consumes, it goes 3 to 4 times the distance that a fossil fuel car does, because most of the fossil fuel cars' energy is just being burnt, wasted as heat. Overall, an electric car is, in any scenario, a cleaner option if you're going to run it for its life. But we are also aware of the environmental problems that come from mining these metals, and we should be aware of them. There are human rights issues, there are environmental issues. But the nice thing is that there are alternatives. So now the dominant source of battery material is not cobalt, it's iron, it's lithium iron phosphate. That's the battery material that is being used in Teslas. That's the battery material that's used in vast majority of Chinese cars. And so India doesn't need to find new cobalt. India has plenty of iron already. It just needs to figure out how to make lithium iron phosphate. So what happens is when you think about these problems, you do come up with alternatives, and those alternatives, which require innovation, which require support, can be much better than what the environmental problem was such as cobalt, where we thought for a long time there couldn't be a better option, but we do now have one.
Chapter 4 of your book talks about how India's big push for solar power could inspire other developing countries. But a recent study by a top Indian institute, I'm talking about the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, it's a think tank, it warns that India's ambitious goal of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 might actually widen the gap between richer states in the west and south, which have a lot of sunshine for solar, and poorer states in the north and east, which have a lot of coal reserves but not a lot of sunshine. So these poorer states might have to even buy their electricity from the richer ones to meet their climate goals because we are moving on this path of decarbonization. So how can India be both a green leader and ensure and if everyone benefits from this shift to renewables?
So that's a very good question. Given the size of India, it's very good to look at it within India, but it's also true globally. If you look at certain countries, they just have much more potential for a certain type of resource versus other countries that don't. Take an example of Saudi Arabia, blessed with oil, but it's also blessed with the sun. It's not really tapping into the sun, it's tapping into the oil right now. And so, one way in which the nice solution, at least for an intra country problem like the one that you've raised, is that India can deploy a lot of transmission lines. One thing that we know that renewable energy versus coal does is renewable energy is intermittent. That sun doesn't shine all the time, wind doesn't blow all the time. And so you do need ways to store that energy, but that's quite expensive. And but the other one is to be able to move it long distances from the places where it's being produced to the places where it is being generated. And so if you have more transmission lines, then you'll be able to ensure that the places that do not have enough sun. And it's not quite true in all eastern states. It's true in northeastern states to some extent, but solar resources are quite well distributed in the country. Wind resources are less distributed, but yes, land itself is a very precious commodity in India. So it is important that you allow for a lot more transmission to happen. The other thing, which is also very important, and you raised this point, which is eastern states where a lot of coal is mined, if we start reducing the consumption of coal and thus production of coal, those states will have to have a transition plan to be able to move workers in coal, to be able to move the income for that state from coal to other forms of income. And the federal government has a responsibility to think about these changes, because if it doesn't, then there will be tensions created that are unnecessary. The nice thing about this is not happening tomorrow. This will be a transition over the next decades, 2 decades, 3 decades. And so you have time to be able to ensure that a plan can be laid out, but it's an absolutely crucial point.
In your chapter, which is called The Billionaire, you talk about Bill Gates and how he's trying to fight climate change using technology through his investments. While he puts a lot of money into green solutions, some people worry he's focusing too much on those techno fixes or tech gadgets, and ignoring the bigger pictures. Because they say that the climate crisis is more than that, right? Like it's also about money, politics, and making sure everyone benefits from these solutions. And right now, most people think that we should all come together and figure out how to tackle this problem as a team. Like you talk about consensus building or you talk about democratic deliberations. So, isn't it a bit one sided for someone as powerful as Mr. Gates to have so much say in how things are done? And it doesn't sound very democratic, does it?
The point of that chapter is what he supports, the core message that I feel is worthy of other people listening and recognizing, is that technology development is very important for the energy transition. Because what technology development does is it gives you options for being able to solve the same problem in multiple ways. And that's really important because, as you said, not every country has the same resource, doesn't have the same metal that is needed or solar or wind that is needed. Every country has its own unique mix of problems that it needs to deal with. If it has technology options available, that makes the problem easier to solve. The second thing that that chapter does is to look at finance. Now, technology innovation is something that is difficult because the problem itself is hard and requires upfront capital investment where you don't know whether you'll get that technology developed or not. So you're taking a risk.
Right.
Typically, that risk is taken by governments because governments can take that kind of risk, that they can produce scientific research and not have something tangible to show for it because they are producing scientific research. But what he goes on to show is that through private capital, through money, not just his money, but other people's money, you can actually fund these ideas. Now, as for the non democratic part of it, I think that is a weird one because it's not like he is a political leader. What he is trying to do is take his money and try and invest in the areas that he thinks is important. Now, it's his money and he can do what he wants with it. For the democracy part, it's really important for governments to ensure that if there are technologies that are developed, say through the work that Bill Gates has done, whether those technologies are something they would like to take on and deploy, whether those are the technologies that are right for them to be able to use. So the democracy is still very much within the power of the country and the government where the technology is deployed, and thus in the power of people, at least in democratic countries where you can vote for the right politicians to take on the technology that is of benefit to them.
So, in the recently concluded COP28 climate meet, there were discussions suggesting that we should invest in technology that captures and stores carbon dioxide underground, which is CCUS. And in the book, you write that worries about leaks in the system are probably not scientifically true. You mentioned that there have been years of scientific studies on that account. But a study that came out last year by the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IFA, it recently found that most CCS projects, they were talking about 13 flagship projects around the world, they haven't worked well. In fact, 10 out of 13 of them haven't they have either failed or they have failed to reach any sort of optimum capacity whatsoever. And even the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is worried about leaks and about how good the technology really is. So, if even like a body like the IPCC, which is full of influential scientists, they are unsure, then why should we trust CCS as a technology?
Carbon capture is multiple step technology. The first is to separate the gases that are produced from, say, a coal power plant or an industry like a steel plant, where you get a mixture of gases. You'll get carbon dioxide, nitrogen, because there's so much of that, some unburnt oxygen, and you separate carbon dioxide. So that's the first step, right? Then you have to move it. That's the second step. You have to take it, compress it, make it liquid, move it in a pipe or whatever, or truck sometimes, and then the final step is where you put it underground and store it. What has happened, and this is true, and I talk about it in the book as well, but since the book was, finished in 2022 and came out in 2023, I've done more reporting. The problem with carbon capture as a technology is it's not one thing. It's because it's multiple steps and all of them have to work in tandem, not just from a technology perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Like the price of capturing and transporting and sinking has to be paid for by somebody. If they don't work in tandem, then the technology. The leakage side is not true. What you're saying is not true. And I can point to scientific studies both from the IPCC, but the IPCC doesn't do scientific studies. It just collates and assesses what already exists. From a storage perspective, we know we have for the past 50 years been storing CO2 underground. In fact, it's going in the same places where oil and gas comes from most of the time. And in fact, there are CO2 stores underground. There are entire fields where instead of gas, there's actually CO2. So we know that underground, we can store them. It's not like a tank. It's really rock with pores in it. And you put CO2 as a liquid in there. And yes, leakage, I never say in the book, is not a concern. It is something you need to monitor and verify and ensure. So any place where you store CO2 is required, at least in countries where CCS is being deployed, by regulation required to monitor for leaks. There's a case in Algeria where a company built a carbon capture project and realized after a year or two of operation that there was leakage happening. So they had to seal the project and continue to monitor it.
The
From
InSouth
a
project, you mean?
We can get into the entire debate about carbon capture if you would like, but from a storage perspective, there are issues that need to be monitored. It's not that we cannot do it at all. So none of the scientists, at least at a level of meta-analysis, of a level of multiple studies, say that you should not use it. What the scientists do say, and this is perhaps an addition beyond the book, which is because the technology requires these multiple steps and it's so complicated and the economics have been difficult, only deploy it for the things that you absolutely have no other option for.
Next question is about the chapter on climate litigation and the power of climate activism, which is the campaigner. You write that the UK's climate law offers a good template for other countries to adapt with their own tweaks, of course. But in India, things are tough. Like as several media reports suggest, recent laws to come to mind are like there have been amendments to the Biological Diversity Act. There has been the Forest Conservation Act. So these laws have actually made it easier to chop down forests and punish polluters much less than they used to be before. Experts have even said that forget new laws, like even court orders just end up in committees or reviews at best. So how can climate activists in India, push for better laws and policies?
So governance is a huge challenge. I take the example of the UK because the way the law was structured and way the law came about allowed for power for those laws to actually work quite well. So just to go through the story briefly, the UK passed the Climate Change Act in 2008. When it passed it, every party in the parliament voted for it. And so it had cross parliamentary support and it created the law ordered the government to create something called the Climate Change Committee, which is going to then do annual analysis of what the government must do and what the government is doing. So it would not just give them suggestions and directions, but also check whether the progress is being made or not. If India copies that, there is much more likelihood for climate action to happen. But the challenge in India is that you still require a level of first awareness in the public about the climate challenge, that many of the problems that India faces right now, from water issues, from air pollution issues, are problems that can be solved if you tackle climate change, or that many of the problems that India faces through droughts or through lower productivity on agriculture or through heat waves, which are many and more increasing, are because of climate change. I think there is a lack of connecting the dots in the Indian understanding of the issue on what is being caused by climate change and what could be solved if we take climate solutions. And until that happens, then people won't vote for it. And if people don't vote for it, then people won't have governments that would respond to what the people want. Ideally, should be to try and tackle these issues because India is among the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. And of course, from its history, India is has contributed much less than America or Europe or China. So India is suffering, even though it's suffering in an unfair way, but India does have the solutions to deploy for it. And so what I think climate activists or anybody who cares about these issues must do is to try and make sure that people are aware of these issues and that they are given choices to vote for the right politicians who would support these ideas.
You were at COP28. How do you see the two major pronouncements of the conference? On the very first day, we got the loss and damage fund, and as well as the final resolution to transition away from fossil fuels as opposed to phase out. And of course, there's also the central question of climate finance and adaptation. So, what is your assessment of COP28 on these?
Yes, so COP28 was a very important COP because going into that meeting, it was the meeting that was supposed to take stock take. It was called a global stock take on where things stand. And we knew going in that for the goals that have been set, which is keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5, you need to have emissions globally by 2030. And we're nowhere on track to do that. So, what you needed as a response from the leaders from the countries going to COP28 was to come up with steps that would allow you to actually get to that point. And one of the steps inevitably means using fewer fossil fuels. The transitioning away is a global goal to transition away. But the interesting thing is, in the 30 years of climate diplomacy, fossil fuels or phasing out or even transitioning away from fossil fuels had never been mentioned as a political outcome at a COP meeting, which might seem strange given we know the science is very clear that you have to move away from fossil fuels. But the reality is that a COP outcome comes from consensus. Every country has to agree. And many of the countries in there are fossil fuel producers who wouldn't want to agree because their business model depends on producing fossil fuels. So it is a big deal that in COP28 you did get all countries agreeing to transitioning away from fossil fuels. However, the outcome and the success of it will only be determined whether countries actually follow through on the commitment that they've made. Now, the loss and damage fund. So the best way to think about climate change is to think about it in three buckets. One is you have to deal with the source of the problem, which is emissions, which are coming from fossil fuels. So you reduce them. So we talked about that. The second is because we are late in trying to tackle with this problem, we've just baked in a bunch of warming that's already happened, will happen. And that requires you to then create systems that will be adapting or will be adaptable to that level of warming. And that requires a bunch of innovation. So things like weather warning systems, which India's done really good job on, where when we have cyclones and hurricanes coming through Bay of Bengal most of the time, but sometimes from the Arabian Sea, we now have warning systems that warn people, that move them to shelters, that take them away from the harm, and thus we're able to reduce the number of deaths. Very important step. But other adaptation techniques, such as what do you do in heat waves? Are there places that are cooling centers where people can go and um, uh, get away from the heat because long-term exposure to heat can be quite harmful, even lead to deaths. So there are many things that we can do to adapt to the many impacts that are baked in by climate change. And we got some progress at COP28 on that. There was a global goal on adaptation, just directionally setting aims on the types of things that we need to adapt and what countries must do. But over the next 2 years, by COP30, they need to then set numerical targets on how we are going to reach those adaptation goals. So the work was done, but only half. And then the third bucket, which is if you don't deal with the source of the problem or adapt to the warming, is there will be damage from climate impacts. And so you need to create a system such as a loss and damage fund that was created where rich countries put in money and that allow developing countries to deal with the impacts. So Pakistan suffered from spectacularly bad floods in 2022, caused $30 billion worth of damage. Who deals with that? That's where the loss and damage fund can come through and help countries at least start to recover quickly. And that was important. But again, the amount of money in there is quite small. It's only $750 million. You require billions and hundreds of billions, maybe eventually. And so the next goal will be how do you get countries to commit to more money? Are there many other sources of money for that part? So there was plenty of progress at COP28, but COPs are places that are slow moving and they are only successful if the governments who then committed to these goals actually deploy them in their home country.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Akshat. And that's all from Frontline Conversation.